Goal today is to talk through the implications of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, both causes and consequences. I should say this will be the start of, I think, many discussions, debates, considerations. This is by no means the only event that we'll have on this and the only activity, but it's something that, of course, I think our whole community will be grappling with, not just today, but in the coming months and even years to come. And I say that because when I saw the reactions of many people, not just in the West, but really worldwide to this invasion, it reminded me of my generation when in 1989 the wall fell here in Berlin, or the generation after mine for 9/11, or indeed what is happening now. It's a sort of event that impacts more than just those who are directly involved, and it impacts more than just the policy involved. Okay, it's not just a certain type of crisis. It really impacts many others, and to put it all together and to see how in very quick time the world changes is going to take a lot of firepower intellectually to think through all of this. Just to give you some examples, the idea that Sweden and Finland, neutral countries, are sending arms someplace. The idea that Germany is pledging a major rearmament here, a major upgrade of its army. And as someone who studies the European Union, who often talks about 1952, this European defense community that was signed and never became reality, the idea that the European Union is sending MiG-29 fighter jets to Ukraine. And if I read Twitter correctly, and I don't know how reliable this is, I needed to ask Anita to see if this is an accurate source, but apparently many of those MiGs have already even been delivered. You can get a sense that the world has changed very quickly in just a matter of days. Well, I was talking about consequences, but of course there are causes, and I don't know how many of you are game theorists, but as someone who aspires to be at least a somewhat practicing game theorist, we often want to think about the step before in a game tree and think about how the causes of a crisis may indeed affect the consequences or the responses. So today's topic is one that we have three eminent professors from our Center of International Security who are here, who've been talking a lot about this, not just now, but have been talking about this in the months and even years before this crisis indeed broke out. I have Marina Henke, who is Professor of International Relations and indeed Director of the Center for International Security. She will start and give us a big picture. Julian Wucherpfennig is Professor of International Affairs and Security. He will go second, and if I'm correct, we'll talk a bit about exit strategies, maybe other things too. I look forward to what he has to say. And of course, Anita Gohdes, who's Professor of International and Cybersecurity, and will also give us a bit of the cyber context, I think is correct, but some other things as well. I say we'll give these contexts. One thing we discussed is that the goal really is to reach out to the community and to hear from you. So they're not going to each speak for 20 minutes and then there are two questions and then we're done. It is going to be designed to really, they're going to give short inputs. I might ask a question or two, but most importantly is you have a chance to ask questions and to make comments. And indeed, we talk as a community about what has happened. So without further ado, I turn over the floor to Marina Henke. Marina?
Thank you so much, Mark, and welcome everybody to this event today. I'm also extremely impressed by the online numbers. I see 291 people joining us online, so welcome to you. And if you have questions, of course, we would be happy to take your questions as well. So many of you know that I'm very interested in strategy. I'm teaching a grand strategy class here at the Hertie School. And that's why I would like to focus in my opening statement on, why Ukraine matters in the grand strategic picture. And I would like to take you back to the 1990s. And I know, many of you haven't even been born in the 1990s, but others still remember, they were fairly young like me, or others, like how Mark alluded to, remember this in their teenage years or later. The 1990s, and not just in Europe and North America, but I think worldwide, were quite special years. Most of all, those who were attached to democracy, attached to liberalism, to freedom, were quite happy because the bottom line of the early 1990s were democracy had won. Liberalism had won. The people who had stood up to the Soviet autocrats at the time had in the big picture of things, fought for democracy and fought for human rights and the rule of law, and they had won. And so with this great enthusiasm, a decade started, and then slowly democracies started to make mistakes. Some of the mistakes in particular, from my perspective, from the security perspective, were interventions. This is, of course, Iraq, but also Afghanistan, Libya. And then there were also mistakes on the social front, increasing inequality, difficulties with racial tensions, mistakes on the economic front, economic crisis, whether this is the mortgage crisis in the United States or the euro crisis in Europe and all across the world. And so autocracies rose to the occasion. Of course, first and foremost, China was able to offer a different kind of model. And it was a model that promised economic growth because they could really demonstrate, that they, from a pretty poor country in a couple decades, grow very, very wealthy and, could create a new middle class. And they offered also order and stability. And for some of you, it might sound bizarre why some populations would opt for order and stability instead of democracy and freedom. But truth to be told, if you pass through a period of chaos, order and stability sometimes actually looks quite appealing. And so for a while, China and also other autocracies, and here I'm looking at Russia, they actually, had quite some soft power. And there was a battle raging, well, there is a battle raging in the economic sphere, most importantly between the United States and China, but Huawei was one of the big examples, and also on the soft power sphere, and more like the political diplomatic sphere, like various African countries and other developing countries trying to decide whether they wanted to be with China, whether they wanted to take loans and other benefits and incentives from China or military aid from Russia, or whether they wanted to stick to, that kind of the rules-based world order that the West, the United States and Europe were offering them. And these dividing lines, were popping up all across the globe, even inside of the European Union with Hungary, sometimes straining on this authoritarian front, inside of the United States, where you had actors such as Trump, brazenly sometimes voicing his support for Putin and for authoritarian leaders. And then, the expectation was growing that this authoritarian camp would just not contest the liberal world order politically and economically, but it might contest it as well militarily. But truth to be told, the focus of this contestation, or the expectation where this contestation would happen, was China and Taiwan and the South China Sea, I would say very frankly. People didn't really expect that the major withdrawal of the borders and the first big military contestation between those two new camps would happen by Russia. Now, there were some suspicions, but the expectation was that it would first be Taiwan. Well, it came differently. And the first major withdrawal attempt, at least, a military attempt, where you see these two blocks contesting one another, now became Ukraine. And that's why, Ukraine is, in the big picture of things, about much more than just Ukraine, the country per se, although of course, Ukraine absolutely matters as well. But in Russia and in China, there is an impression that the West is on decline, that Western society is very much weakened, that democracy is on decline, that the liberal world order is worthless. And there was an expectation that, Russia could very easily take, for various reasons, Ukraine. But one of the big reasons was that nobody would respond, that basically Ukraine would just crumble and nobody would actually help Ukraine. And here, I must say that they miscalculated. Right? So that there is an entire coalition, there is, a united front helping the Ukrainians, and I would say a lot of them, in particular what you see here in Europe, but also why the kind of transatlantic community is so strong, because they realize that this is not just, again, a battle about Ukraine, but it's really a battle that looks at, you know, the future of the world order, this liberal world order, based on the rule of law, based on democracy, that is under attack. And what happens in Ukraine, you know, in one form or other, will also inform what happens to Taiwan and maybe other attempts to redraw that order. And this is what actually plays out here on the very big geostrategic level. And that's why Ukraine is so special and why it mobilizes and I think touches so many people, not just here in Europe, but, you know, like, frankly, across the world.
Yeah, hello everyone. Thank you all for coming. I want to supplement Marina's thoughts. You know, she took a more of a bird's eye perspective with some conjectures about what may happen on the ground. That is how the whole thing is going to unfold in Ukraine. And to cut a long story short, I think my main point is going to be that this war isn't going to go away anytime soon. That is, the situation or warfare in Ukraine is here to stay, at least for the time being. Why is that? Well, Marina already alluded to the fact that Russia came into Ukraine with certain expectations, and based on what we know, it seemed like the expectation was that this would be over relatively soon, that they would march in, and that they essentially would be welcomed as saviors. Now, this is the exact opposite of what has happened, and if you put this together with the reactions from the West that you know, the EU, NATO, the US, all kinds of countries have pledged to provide supplies, to provide weapons. All of this is going to aid the Ukrainians, and it's going to make a Russian victory less likely. A Russian victory being less likely also means that this war is going to drag on, and it's going to drag on for a long time. Now, with regard to this war being over at some point, I think it's important to get a sense of what it is that Putin actually wants. And if we, you know, there are different explanations or different analysts essentially place different degrees of premium on different aspects in Putin's utility function. But one dimension here is clearly the European security architecture that Marina alluded to. A second explanation focuses more on domestic factors. That is, Putin is trying to divert that attention from problems at home. And a third explanation focuses on what he has actually told us literally, or what he has provided in writing, that is in terms of a nationalist card that he's been playing, where he's trying to restore essentially an empire from the 19th century, and is basically trying to secure his place in the history books. So all these goals essentially are very difficult to meet for any sort of bargain at the moment, and especially if you put this in relation to the type of resolve that we have seen on the side of Ukrainians. It seems that, at least for the time being, we are very far away from any kind of negotiated bargain in this conflict. And so my expectation for the peace talks, or these presumed peace talks that are to take place shortly, there is no bargaining space. There is no mutually preferred option that both would seek preferable to continuing this war at this point. Now, with this war dragging on, some further conjectures, we are going to see a lot of refugees coming from this conflict. According to UNHCR estimates, we're at 500,000 now. The expected numbers go up to 7 million. That remains to be seen. But what is clear is that as long as Ukrainians will receive weapons, supplies, and as long as Russia doesn't manage to interfere with this supply, the war is essentially going to drag on, and it will be very difficult to resolve. Now, I don't have any clear conjectures of how a way out might look, but what is clear is that this is going to take sacrifices on both sides, yeah, perhaps we can come back to this in the Q&A.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Good to see you all, even if the occasion is not a happy one. I want to talk a little bit about the cyber dimension. Many people have been commenting and wondering about maybe the relative lack or absence of major cyber operations in the context of the now ongoing invasion. And maybe it's important for us to kind of distinguish between cyber operations aimed at sabotage, aimed at infiltration and ultimately breaking things, and then also cyber operations aimed at information warfare. And so if we look at what's been going on in the last few weeks or in the last few days within Ukraine and also within Russia, we really can't understand that if we don't understand that ultimately Ukraine has been at war with Russia for the last 8 years, or at least parts of Ukraine have been at war for the last 8 years. And so we've seen, and many people have reported on this, and many people have been researching this, that ultimately Russia has been treating Ukraine as a kind of test lab for cyber operations. And many cyber experts assume that one of the reasons we're seeing this kinetic attack now, this military attack, is because ultimately the cyber operations have had very limited strategic value up until now. And so what that means is that if this is the background that we're thinking about, it makes sense that we're currently not seeing cyber kind of being front and center in these current military operations. Cyber capabilities, of course, are much more they're not quite as stable and they're much easier to lose, and so it makes sense that once actual military interventions have started, we're likely to see less of an emphasis on the cyber dimension. Another reason why we're seeing specifically Ukrainian infrastructure being less vulnerable to cyber attacks is because for the last 8 years, they have massively invested both in human but also in technical capabilities to improve their cyber capabilities. And so one of the things we've been seeing is that this has spilled over into the private sector within Ukraine as well. And this is really now leading to many, many volunteers who don't work within the public sector, actually galvanizing support and organizing themselves to really build a so-called IT defense or IT army, as the Prime Minister of Ukraine called it. And so we're likely to see, as Julian was just saying, this war drags on, cyber become important at different times, but this is a clear sign that there is no way in which cyber, if we might call it warfare, is a substitute for military warfare as we're seeing it. The second thing I want to talk about are information operations. I think this is something that everyone is thinking about right now, and many people have been surprised by the way in which the Ukrainian side has really used information to its own advantage. And I want to give you kind of an idea of how to think about this. If you think about the information operations on the side of Russia, and we of course know from the 2016 US elections that Russia is capable of launching quite sustained information operations. Ultimately, the messaging by the Russian government right now, by Putin, is different depending on who the audience is, right? So if we think about it, within Russia, much of the communication is geared towards silence, towards avoiding the topic, and actually banning outright mentioning of war. Within Ukraine, the goal would be to project fear and kind of project this idea that the Russian military has already gained most of the territory and people should surrender because there's no chance anyway. Within Russia, the idea is to reinforce that Ukrainian government are Nazis and drug addicts that need to be removed. And then internationally, there's this idea of pushing this narrative of NATO aggression. So we're talking about different types of stories that need to be maintained from roughly the same sources. And if we compare that with Ukraine, we're really seeing, regardless of whether it's the president, regardless of whether it's journalists, they're all communicating the same message. And that is that, as Marina said, this is not just us fighting against Russia, it's us fighting for the free world, it's us fighting for democracy. We're the anti-war coalition. There's proper branding around the narrative of this conflict. And so if you only have to follow one story because that's the story you truly believe in, that might actually give you an advantage vis-a-vis having multiple stories that you have to maintain. But maybe as a final word, I think it's too early to say who is ultimately, has the upper hand on this front. Thanks.
Excellent. Let me take yours. Sorry, excellent. I very much appreciated all three impulses. I'm going to ask one question to each of you just to get this started, and then I'm going to open it up to all of you. As I ask a question, formulate yourselves what your question will be, so we don't have that awkward pause at the beginning and don't know who wants to ask a question, but the question is already ready to go. So my first question for you, Marina, is, and it's something you've been writing a lot about, but perhaps you could address a bit the so-called nuclear option. I mean, this is something that President Putin brought up recently. There's been discussion specifically of tactical nuclear weapons, and perhaps you've been writing on this before there was even any thought of nuclear weapons. Perhaps you could say a few words on this topic.
Yes, so is this on? No? Yeah. As you know, at the Center for International Security, we have been one of the very few research centers on nuclear security in Germany. And for us, when Russia was building up first 100 and then 120, then 130, 150,000 troops, the possibility that in one form or another, Putin would invoke nuclear weapons was almost certain. So why is that the case? Well, because in the big picture of things, Putin actually stands to lose against NATO in a conventional battle, and he knows that. So if there was really an escalation, and by the way, it will not happen, right? But if there was an escalation between NATO and Russia, NATO still has much stronger conventional forces. And in such an asymmetry of conventional forces, but where there is equality at the nuclear level, we tend to see that the weaker part uses threats of nuclear escalation to compensate for the conventional weakness. I hope that makes sense, because I know it's quite complicated, but it's fairly logical. So we're expecting very, very early on that if Putin, in one form or another, whether this was on the battlefield or also diplomatically, politically, if he felt cornered, he would threaten nuclear use. And that's exactly now the situation that we're in. Just that he, so he's surprised that the Ukrainians use, such strong resistance. And I think he's also surprised what I mentioned earlier, that NATO stands so united, and actually, that the sanction packages are so strong, and I'm telling you, they're actually quite strong. And then, of course, what happens as well here in Germany, what happens in Sweden, in Finland, in all those countries that probably Putin expected to, have somewhat of a lukewarm response, that all of these countries really stepped up to the plate and, came out extremely strongly. So in such a scenario, where he is right now, where he feels diplomatically, politically, and to a certain degree militarily, although, I think militarily it's less acute than on the political and diplomatic level, but still, he feels threatened. It makes a lot of sense to now threaten nuclear, usage. But, and I think that's very important for you to know as well, the purpose of this is psychological, first and foremost, okay? Using nuclear weapons has a totally different psychological, emotional impact on audiences than just threatening, to use conventional weapons. So I'm actually, we don't see that he's actually readying any nuclear forces. And I'm telling you, the Americans have very good intelligence on this. They were, right on target on all Russian developments, build up, how it would happen and all these kind of things. So if they say, they're not readying these forces, I believe it. And so I think for the time being, it's just, it's kind of, it's a trump card, if I may say, even in negotiations, that Putin tries to yield to up his leverage, to up his bargaining power. But for the time being, I wouldn't be too concerned that he actually uses them. I can go into detail if you're interested in, like a doctrine which is called escalates to de-escalate, that would involve tactical nuclear weapons, but maybe we leave this for the Q&A.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Marina. Just one question for you, Julian. You talked about this idea, you argued, in fact, that the war would probably drag on a long time and that we need to think about the consequences of this. The hopes of those who've imposed economic sanctions is that Putin would run out of money and he couldn't afford a long war. And I'd just like to give you a chance to comment on that. I mean, the fact that, especially the sanctions on the central bank in particular, the seeming runs on banks today, will this have the sort of effect that the West is hoping, or is the war going to drag out as you suggest?
Yeah, I think the ideas that stand behind the sanctions packages are entirely consistent with this view. That is, no one really expects these sanctions to hit really hard from one day to the next. Rather, this is going to be something that pans out in the medium run. And so, thinking about the sanctions package as part of a war of attrition is the technical term here, where basically the idea is that whoever depletes their resources first walks away as the loser, is entirely consistent with the fact that we're going to see this for a long time. And it's going to take time until the sanctions hit. I'd like to add, if there is anything we know from sanctions research, that is basically the moment we see sanctions in practice, at that point the sanctions in principle have failed, right? It's kind of counterintuitive, but if sanctions were working, then they should have worked as a deterrent, right? They should have been effective at the threat stage rather than at the implementation stage. So now that suggests that Putin saw the sanctions coming and quite clearly factored this into his decision calculus. Now, I don't think he got the calculations entirely right, but at least in terms of the sanctions, he saw something coming, and so that's part of the calculus to begin with.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Julian. And a final question for you, Anita. You argued that there hasn't been many cyber operations thus far. You also talked about the fact that Ukraine, for really the last 8 years, hasn't been engaged in war. I guess the question I would have here is, could this expand? I mean, could the retaliation for the economic sanctions be indeed cyber operations against Germany, against the US, or other sorts of places? And indeed, maybe the Ukrainians were ready for it, but are we?
Thank you. I'll just correct myself and say we have seen many cyber operations. They've just been of limited strategic value, and I think that's an important point here. We're likely seeing dozens of cyber operations going on right now, including against Western institutions. The question is to what extent those are going to have a strategic impact. And so I think we have to distinguish between seeing cyber operations occurring and then the actual impact they might have on the outcome of the conflict. But I think we can all say, as a practical input, enable two-factor authentication, check your passwords. It's probably a good time to do that in general, if I may say that.
Well, some good practical advice. Thank you very much, Anita. Okay, let's open this up. And I should say, I see we now have set up a mic. So what I would suggest you do is go up and speak into the mic. I think that's probably also the safe way of doing things in COVID times, to go speak into the mic as opposed to having somebody running around all the time. So I would love to see someone go up and ask the first question. I should say that online as well, I think we have many participants right now. Are we set up to also have questions from online? Yes, we are. Excellent. I would also like to encourage anybody to come up here. Please.
So there have been reports that the first nuclear plant has been taken over by Russian forces. What is the risk situation like that we will have an accident in these kinds of scenarios? Like already the Chernobyl area has been taken over before. I can imagine that running these places is more difficult than a gas station. So will there be an expected easy transition, or is this a high risk scenario?
Good question. Who would like, I'm guessing Marina, but
So actually, this is incredibly risky for the soldiers who are in Chernobyl. I'm assuming these are now Russian soldiers in the majority. This is where the nuclear waste is, right? As you probably know, there's a massive dome over the nuclear site. They tried to actually refurbish the dome. There's a huge construction site there as well. So of course one could think, if there are cracks in the dome, wind and rain can pick it up and then create a larger wasteland. But truth to be told, I think for the time being, it's just incredibly dangerous for the folks right there. So I wouldn't be too, if you were here in Berlin, too worried that, we will have a nuclear rain or catastrophe anytime soon from Chernobyl, right? So I think it's a very different type of kind of nuclear scenario, right? So launching nuclear weapons is something else than an explosion of a nuclear reactor. So I think that's you can control to a certain amount the nuclear explosion of a nuclear weapon. Of a reactor, it's a totally different story. But the radiation then is in the environment of the reactor for the most part. Yeah.
very good. Thank you very much. Let me then go online to Errol Rizza, please. You're muted, it looks like.
Sorry. Good afternoon, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to take part in this panel discussion. I would like to direct my question to Marina. There is a school of thought that says that the Minsk agreement should have been implemented and given regional autonomy to the Donbass, and possibly the war could have been avoided. It's inconceivable that if a regional autonomy, which probably would have given up some sovereignty of Ukraine to make certain decisions, but possibly it could have avoided war and could have given Ukraine the prospect of getting into the EU. Can you please address this, if you like, argument that the war could have been avoided had the Minsk agreement been implemented?
So the Minsk agreement. Two provisions of the Minsk agreement were violated. And it's true that both sides violated them. So I would say that both, so the Russian and the Ukrainian side, they share responsibility for the breakdown of the Minsk agreement. So which were the provisions? On the Ukrainian side, they were asked to change their constitution to give more autonomy to the Donbass region. So one, could think of like more of a kind of federalist type system. The second violation, however, and this didn't happen. So it's absolutely true. So some laws were introduced in the Ukrainian Congress, Parliament, but they never passed. So it is true that the Ukrainian government didn't comply on these Minsk provisions. On the other side, so meaning on the separatist side, and like when you speak of the separatists, you always have to speak of Russia, because the truth is that the separatists wouldn't, have started the rebellion without Russian help, and I think that's very, very important to always have in mind. So how did they violate Minsk? Well, the heavy weaponry was never fully removed, so they always still had heavy weapons. And the second one the violation was that, yes, they could have organized local election, meaning for, like the local councils and, like kind of in a federal system where you have like even like local ministers. But instead, they actually held elections for, the president of the Donbass region, meaning like, declaring total independence instead of this kind of like more localized, federalized system. So both sides violated this agreement. And then, in the big picture of things, frankly, there was no interest anymore in upholding Minsk. And so that's why, I think, of course, people can always say, like this beautiful agreement, and especially here in Germany, there's a lot of pride attached to it because it was negotiated by former Chancellor Merkel and the French. But truth to be told, it was an agreement that had been dead. What could have been done is like in a completely new round of negotiations. But I think, as Julian said, the bargaining space was almost non-existent. And when you don't have a bargaining space in peace negotiations, then, like these negotiations, they're, very, very difficult to have. And that's the big problem with, negotiating anything in the conflict.
Did either of you want to say? Okay, then let me bring in also online Andrea Rümmele, who is, of course, Dean of Executive Education, who happens to be at Brown University right now. And it looks like her internet's working just fine.
Yes, hi. Thank you all very much, and great that we are actually having this event, and also great seeing the forum full once again, which hasn't been the case for a long time due to COVID. I have one clarification question to Marina and Julian, and then an overall question on Russian civil society. I wasn't quite sure whether I got your points on the sanctions right, because Marina, when I listened to you, you said that these sanctions really have they're strong, and from that, I also got that you think they are very effective. But what Julian then said is that once actually sanctions already are being taken, it's already too late. So I was just wondering whether you could briefly position yourself towards that. And my main question is, and that's to the whole panel, is where does Russian civil society actually stand right now? Is there any quote unquote hope that they would stand up against the Putin regime?
Perhaps I can take the sanctions question and clarify what I meant. Basically, my point was that yes, the sanctions are useful. They do have their place, but they're no silver bullet, right? If the sanctions were a silver bullet, they would have been a deterrent weapon, which would have prevented the whole thing from blowing up in the first place. And so the sanctions are one measure of the package, and they'll do their damage. They'll do the damage in the long run or in the medium run, but sanctions alone will not solve this conflict.
Can I briefly add something? So I think, here's, so in Putin's war plans, he counted on sanctions. So in the Russian central bank war chest, there's 600 billion US dollars. And so he was like already assuming we will have a certain sanction package, and, I will be able to use that money to compensate the businesses or the sectors affected. I think where he miscalculated, and this is, Andrea, like where I think your question comes in, he did not expect that the sanction package would be as hard as it is right now. Because truth to be told, so for example, I think he didn't expect that SWIFT, so SWIFT is a complicated question, but I think it wouldn't be touched at all. Now it is. And I think maybe even, in general, like on some other sectors, he miscalculated and thought, they could avoid certain sanctions. And now we see that, like ruble is down to some of the lowest levels ever, and the entire stock market crashed by over 30%. And so, for example, that BP as well, like just, dropped its stock in Gazprom, like, so all these kind of ramifications, I think he didn't really count on. And so while in theory, like he already expected with these sanctions to have impact, I think he didn't expect the impact that they're actually now having. And so, yes, it was a deterrence failure, but also a miscalculation on Putin's part. And so maybe like the big mistake was that in one way or another, the West wasn't taken seriously on their sanction threat.
Maybe just to say something on the Russian civil society, and also to come back to the question of information warfare, you might say. So I think one thing the Ukrainian side has been very good at is talking about this being Putin's war and not Russia's war. And I think that has given Russian civil society this option of really mobilizing in support of Ukraine. We've now seen protests in at least 90, if not 100 different places within Russia. We've seen almost 6,000 people reportedly being imprisoned or detained. So if you imagine that just for those 6,000 who were detained, a couple of hundred extra were on the streets, it tells you just how big that group is. And while Putin likely expected some kind of pushback, it's not clear whether he expected the pushback to be this big. We're now seeing increasing censorship and shutting down of media, independent media outlets within Russia. But we're also seeing people questioning to what extent this war is really, happening, to what extent this is something that they want. And I think one thing that we know from a lot of research is that once people believe that they don't have access to information, they will go and look for circumvention tools. And so if the sanctions, achieve nothing else, if they get people to question, to look for information, then that can massively increase the amount of people who are going to look for independent information. So I think we shouldn't underestimate the power or the current mobilization, which is incredibly dangerous on the side of Russian civil society.
Very good. Okay, I see a line over here. So come on up. This is the line for the. Didn't you?
I didn't ask yet.
I'm sorry.
I didn't ask yet, but
Yeah, go ahead.
good. So now that the German government took a new and historic position and clear position about what's happening, how do you think should be the way forward? Perhaps maybe the new German grand strategy, and what could public policy students like us do to help contribute to that long-term goal?
So, I think before we can talk about, German grand strategy, I think we need to kind of think through what are the next steps in that war. How can we somehow, bring that war to an end? Because I think this is actually quite a complicated question. And I think in the big picture of things, Putin miscalculated, and I think he realizes this. But that doesn't mean that he will just, throw his hands up and say, "Oh, I'm so sorry. I'm just pulling out my troops, and please forgive me." This is not something that we will see happening anytime soon. So rather, there are two options. The first option is that he will escalate, right? That he will throw everything that he has at this war to somehow, try to win it. On the domestic front, as Anita mentioned, further repression, further propaganda. And in Ukraine, unfortunately, the escalation, apparently this is at least, if you follow Twitter and what folks report from the ground is, they're in escalation as well, using now fighter jets, a strategic bombing campaign. And of course, this will, unfortunately cause a lot of civilian casualties, right? That's it. So this will be the very sad turn of events. But, what's the logic here? And, since we're here in an academic setting, the logic is that you can basically break the will of the Ukrainians, or, that somebody like Zelensky then says, I want to spare the civilians from these attacks. And so, he will surrender and he will, go into exile or some other settlement, right? So this could be the very sad turn of events, but something that is logically plausible. Much better would be if, we could offer Putin some kind of exit strategy, right? Where he could keep his face, where he wouldn't lose face, but doesn't have to admit that he miscalculated and de facto lost that campaign. And here, we need to think through, what is it that he, what is the middle ground that is acceptable to the Ukrainians and to Russia, right? And so would this be some kind of autonomy for the Donbass after all, but then, he still needs to admit that the attack on all of Ukraine was useless. Would this be acceptable to the Ukrainians right now, frankly, after this, truly heroic effort of defending their country, right? But I think these, you need to go, if was in charge here in Berlin, I would have secret missions, you know, like just like sensing where is there some kind of possible bargaining space out there to avoid, you know, like the first option, which is basically a massive massacre.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to kind of go back and forth because I also have people online that maybe some of you can't see. So the next one is Elena Bascona.
Yeah, thank you very much. I wanted to ask another question on sanctions. So my question is actually divided into parts. The part one is regarding the bargaining space. So how vital are sanctions in widening the bargaining space that we just talked about? Because from my point of view, targeted sanctions could be decisive in leading them towards a negotiation with Russia and perhaps Ukraine. And in particular, Professor Wucherpfennig talked about sanctions not being effective enough, which I agree. But in this case, wouldn't it be possible and decisive also to have European fund to back the economic damage of sanctions? Because I think that what it's vital when it comes to sanctions, it is to be able to uphold them. And so as we had a next generation EU when it came to COVID, wouldn't it make the difference to have a European fund to uphold these sanctions this time and give us more bargaining space when it comes to mediation?
All right. Yeah, Julian?
Yeah, so you're perfectly right. Essentially, you've given the answer to your question by asking your question. What the sanctions do in terms of the bargaining space is they tell the other side that continuing to fight is costly. And by doing so, you make relatively more palatable the alternative that is settling, right? And that's the idea. So as such, as I mentioned earlier, basically the sanctions are part of the package. They supplement military operations on the ground, warfare on the side of the Ukrainians, by exerting additional pressure and basically pushing Russia or pushing Putin towards a deal. Now, you're correct in the sense that this will happen in the medium or long run, and maintaining or upholding the sanctions is going to be costly for the Europeans as well, and so a coordination is needed. How is that going to pan out? We're going to see, but at the moment, I think we've all witnessed, and I was positively surprised by the degree of consensus amongst Europeans, and also the speed with which the sanctions package came about. That at this point, reducing the sanctions or alleviating the sanctions package would actually be the wrong signal by the West that is unlikely at this point.
Very good. We'll move back to in-room. So the next one, please.
Hello. So I was reading about the 1994 Budapest Memorandum, in which Ukraine gave away their nuclear weapons in exchange for security guarantees from the West and Russia, I guess, too. So I was wondering if we basically totally failed to uphold our end of the security guarantees that were made to Ukraine, or if we were, even though they weren't part of NATO, if we had a special responsibility to Ukraine because of that.
Thank you for the question. Who would like to address the 1994 question? There are some other things about the histories too we could get into, but
yeah, so this is obviously a very dangerous precedent. It's not the first time that countries get punished retroactively for giving up nuclear weapons or giving up nuclear programs, Libya being another case in point. This is dangerous precedent for the future. Now, your second part of the question was, did the West have a moral responsibility here in terms of making sure that this agreement was upheld? Well, first of all, this was an agreement between Russia and Ukraine, right? And so basically Russia is the side of the deal here where the reneging took place and where the contract was broken, essentially.
So the United States didn't you call it guarantees, but actually they were just and it's the legal wording that matters, assurances, right? So a guarantee is Article 5 in NATO, you know, like you get attacked and we protect you. An assurance is, you know, if something happens, yeah, you know, we assure you that, you know, like we might be there, but it's legally much less stringent. This is what Ukraine got. And so, but, you know, I absolutely concur with Julian, you know, like a lot of countries are now looking at Ukraine, they're looking at Libya, they're looking at, you know, other countries that dismantled their nuclear weapons, and they're deciding for themselves, like, you know, if I do this and then I become the target of an invasion, I'm in really bad shape. Because the truth is, if Ukraine, and I'm not, you know, like a fan of proliferation, I think this is a terrible world. But, you know, like if Ukraine right now had nuclear weapons, this entire scenario would look very differently. That's just like, that's the case. It wouldn't necessarily look prettier because, like, I think, you know, like the usage of nuclear weapon and like still like the escalation scenario could be quite dramatic as well. So I'm not saying that Russia would have never thought about a similar campaign if Ukraine had those nuclear weapons, but still we would be in a totally different dimension.
Very good. Doing my back and forth. Caroline, who's online?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. So as someone from the Baltics, I'm kind of curious to hear your viewpoint on, so for example, in the last, let's say, week in the Baltic media, there has been a lot of comments from the politicians saying that, we've been saying this for a really long time, this is going to happen. And a lot of Western leaders have now said, yeah, sorry, we were kind of naive. So I'm interested to hear your viewpoint on this like divisive view between Western and like Eastern viewpoints on this topic, and how this might have, you know, long consequences actually after this particular crisis. And what's the aftermath? And just also something I also wrote in the chat earlier, it's a comment, not a question, but 10 years ago, Putin declared very, very concretely that in his view, the fall of Soviet Union is the biggest geopolitical disaster of the 20th century. And he's now very heavily repeating this in the media that's targeting audiences in the Baltics, especially, and the ex-Soviet bloc. And I feel like this is a very big underlying sort of answer to one of the main questions. I think that's kind of also started this talk here now.
Okay, thank you very much for your input. Who would like to address Baltics in East and West?
So Caroline, thanks so much for your question. And I think you're actually right on target. And let me tell you something. So I've been, you know, watching German security policy for, let's say, like about 10 years. And what happened yesterday here was truly remarkable. And I'm not saying this because I'm a security nerd. I'm also a citizen of this country. And I couldn't believe my eyes. You know, I was watching the Scholz speech live here in the Bundestag, and I was like, wow, this is a revolution. And I think, you know, as Sebastian pointed out earlier, how this will be implemented, of course, is still to be determined. Yeah? But that the statement was made is already something that is absolutely extraordinary, right? So since, you know, like the last 30 years, American presidents, French presidents, you know, like EU presidents, you name it, all sorts of folks, you know, like always went to Germany and like used their own ways of convincing and threatening Germany to do this. And big picture of things, nothing happened, nothing. The first budget proposals here of the new government even wanted to reduce defense spending to 1.2%, okay? So it was the opposite. So what you're alluding to, that, you know, that the Baltic states and the threat perception wasn't taken seriously? Absolutely, it wasn't. I'm telling you, as a German citizen, as an observer of German foreign policy, until February 24th, it was not taken seriously. But, and I think this explains to a certain degree as well, this massive reversal, which is truly extraordinary. the the German political elite realized they were wrong. And I was on various talk shows and other events here in Berlin where I saw them waiting in various lobbies, and I could see in their faces that they had been convinced that Putin would never do this, but he did. And so I think actually what we saw yesterday as well here in the Bundestag was not just a kind of a rational move, like a policy decision that came out of very lengthy deliberation. It was actually an emotional reaction, and to a certain degree it involved part fear, but also part guilt that they had been so dumb or so blind that they, didn't see this coming. Because even a week ago, I still had conversations with very high-ranking German politicians, and they told me never. Maybe he takes, like the separatist area, but nothing else, right? So in the big picture of things, I think that was really, how the Germans would call it, this Zeitenwende, huge turnover. And I think it will stay that way. I think this was, to a certain degree, a kind of a 9/11 moment for Germany. So I think the future will be quite different from now, but I think you're right on target to say that until February 24th, they did not take you in the Baltic states and also Poland and other countries in Eastern Europe seriously.
Okay, very good. We're back to the room. Next, please. I have a favor to ask you, and I should have said this at the beginning. Please state your name, because I'm reading everybody online, but I don't know who the people are who are speaking here, and I think it would just be great to hear some names here, especially behind the masks. So please introduce yourself and then ask your question.
Okay, I'm Elie Crespin. I'm a student of MPP program, second year. And actually, my question concerns what you just explained, Marina. How the German government just announced a big increase in military spending. And my question is actually, how much does that make sense since we have two nuclear power in front of each other? And that maybe my assumption is incorrect, but I have the feeling that a conventional confrontation is a serious confrontation is quite unlikely because of the nuclear threat. So how much does that make sense to spend more billions in military in Germany? What does it change? How does that change the ratio of power here? It does not, for me, it stays the same, but maybe my assumptions are incorrect.
So, as you know, nuclear weapons since Hiroshima and Nagasaki have not been used in the battlefield, right? And instead, we have seen a lot of conventional war. So that's why actually still conventional military capability is very important. And also we have two nuclear powers to protect, for example, the Baltics, or even now in Ukraine. I think, it will be fairly and is, so far a conventional war. So why is that so important, that Germany finally takes on a certain responsibility? Well, because, and rightly so, in the United States, a lot of doubts are growing. Is it really worthwhile protecting Europe? And I think that's an absolutely fair question. Because, in the big picture of things, what happens to Europe? So if, Ukraine goes to Russia, that's a problem for us here. For the United States, sure, ideologically, as I said, and with the ramifications for China and so forth, it has implications, but very direct implications are much, much worse for Europe. And I think it makes absolute sense that the United States says you have to step up. We have to, basically share this burden equally. And this was not the case so far. And I would be the first one to say the Europeans, and especially the Germans, not so much the French, they had other businesses, but the Germans were free riding on a security umbrella provided by the United States. And then, you can say well, but, they paid their fair share in the economic realm and in diplomacy and institutions and all these kind of things. Yes, absolutely. But, the truth is, and we see this as well in Ukraine, you can give them a lot of money, you can have the most beautiful institutions, help them with all this kind of stuff, and then you have, fighter jets above your head and they're destroying everything. And I'm the last one to say that military power is something that should be, promoted. But the truth is, if you have a bully in front of you, whose only tool is the military, and then you stand there, you know, waving with a constitution or some kind of law, the bully just doesn't care. And that's just, unfortunately, one of the very, very sad realities of life. And that, you know, like, I think Germany needs to relearn this logic, and I think it just did.
Great. Thank you very much, Marina. Let me move online to, I see Anna Matisia.
Hi, thank you so much for organizing this talk. I would like to ask a question regarding long-term strategy of the European Union, and how does the current declaration to provide Ukrainians with weapons fit in that, and whether the like call for joining Ukraine again, like the repeated call to join Ukraine to the EU, will be heard this time, because it appeared again that Eastern European leaders and Zelensky are again like calling for that. I'm wondering whether the strategy of EU in the long term will change on that, and yeah, what is your opinion?
Good. So the EU question also perhaps bringing in Ukraine.
Yeah, I think this is entirely unlikely, essentially, to answer your question, that EU or NATO support, more specifically, would involve active involvement, would involve troops. And this is, of course, because the moment essentially NATO gets involved, NATO is part of the conflict, and NATO has very clearly stated that that was not part of the plan, that was not going to happen. And so we're going to see this indirect kind of support for Ukrainians in the foreseeable future, and nothing beyond that, I'm pretty sure.
Maybe just to add to that, I think really building on what Marina just said about this, the motivations for seeing the sea change both within Germany and within the EU, a lot of that I think is based on emotions, on fear and guilt, as you said. And so I think we're specifically yesterday, the day before, we saw a lot of new statements by the EU, but with many of those things, we don't actually know yet how they're going to be implemented. Specifically, I'm thinking now also on in the realm of banning certain news media from within Russia. It's entirely unclear how this will be implemented. And so I think we really have to see many of these calls right now also as symbolic. And that is very important, and we shouldn't underestimate that. But the implementation of many of these things is just not clear at this point.
Next, please.
Hi, my name is Philemon Nomikos. I'm a first-year student here at Hertie. My question is probably towards Julian. You mentioned the nationalistic discourse and Putin's desire to rebuild the 19th century empire. And I would like to ask, maybe, could we talk about religion? Because we saw that in 2018, there was a schism between Constantinople and Moscow, essentially Constantinople granting autocephaly to the Ukrainian Eastern Orthodox Church. And this blow to the Russian Orthodox Church, I mean, it must have been huge for Putin. And do you think this could actually be something on the negotiation table? Thank you very much.
It's an interesting question. I think you're overestimating Vladimir Putin as a student of history. I think he has, a very selective and partial reading of history. Now, that doesn't mean that he shouldn't be taken seriously, quite the opposite. I think the nationalist playbook that he has provided can in fact be taken almost literally, and that also makes him predictable. That said, I think in terms of this nationalist thinking that seems to motivate and drive him, a lot is about restoring empire. It's basically about redeeming or correcting injustices that in his mind have occurred to the Russian people. In this sense, I just don't think he's looking at the nitty-gritty details as much as you are. I think this is big picture, restorative nationalism, where he's just concerned about his place in the history books as, you know, presumably recreating this big Russian empire, expanding the map, essentially.
Very good. Thank you, Julian. We move back to a faculty member, to Tabashak Chile, online. You were there, Bashak.
Yeah, can you hear me? Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for this conversation. I would like to get your reactions or your thoughts about the United Nations and the role that it has been playing in the past few days. So very unsurprisingly, the United Nations Security Council met. Its resolution was vetoed by the Russian Federation, so no surprises there. But abstentions by China, India, and the United Arab Emirates. And then a very procedural resolution was passed to move the threat to international peace and security questions to the General Assembly, something that hasn't been done since 1982. So quite a historic, perhaps, move. And I think it's tonight that the United Nations General Assembly is going to discuss the issue, and it may make recommendations to all members of the United Nations. So maybe two questions. One, how significant you think this multilateral effort through the General Assembly is to the things that we've been discussing? And second, whether you think that this will have any change in the course of events that might be unfolding. In particular, would it multilateralize the sanctions, which are currently quite unilateral in many ways, or do you think we should assign any significance to the General Assembly playing any role in the unfolding events? Thank you.
Thank you, Bashak, for this excellent question. I actually, will follow as well very closely what's happening today in the General Assembly. It's like one of the votes that I'm most interested in. Why? Because it goes back to the very first statement I made. So this vote was pushed, let's say, by the United States, by France, by Britain, and by the kind of like NATO allies. And what are they trying to achieve? Well, they're trying to achieve that the democracies, truth to be told, are standing up to the authoritarian regime. So they're trying, and I know this for a fact, they're collecting votes right now because they're asking the questions, who are you with, right? Are you with those who love freedom, who love democracy, who are interested in the rule of law and human rights? Or are you with those, supporting aggression and the violation of any kind of international law that's out there, right? And so basically, of course, it will be mostly a symbolic vote. The vote cannot stop Russia, and it will not immediately, bring Putin to a hold and transfer him into some kind of jail. But I think the symbolic vote can be quite powerful because, again, it is really like the fight in Ukraine as it's portrayed by the Ukrainian, but I think as it's as well perceived by a lot of us, it's about more. It's about, what we're actually fighting for. Let me very quickly, address the second part of your question, which is the UN Security Council and particularly China. So a lot of folks, in the run-up to this crisis expected that China would take a very strong position supporting Russia. As you might remember, Xi Jinping in China welcomed and hosted Putin for the opening of the Olympics, and it was one of the very few one-on-one meetings that he had since the pandemic, and everybody was thinking this is a celebration of a new alliance. Truth to be told, what we saw in the UN Security Council last week, that China abstained, is from this perspective quite remarkable, because people thought that they would vote against the resolution, so with the Russians. So what's the logic here? Well, I will be fairly brief, but there's a lot of assumptions that actually the Chinese leadership is not very happy about this war. Why is it not happy about this war? Because it really brought NATO together. It really brought Europe and the United States together. And this is something that China absolutely does not want. China wants the West to be divided. China wants actually an autonomous Europe. Why? Because they think an autonomous Europe would have a much more lenient position towards China than the United States. The United States is already on a track toward, some kind of opposition, antagonism with China, and that train will not be reversible anytime soon. Europe, actually not yet. As you know, extremely close ties between a lot of European countries and China, and has not been reversed. So China is really interested in kind of dividing the transatlantic community and having, Europe in this quasi-neutral space, trading, with China, and, have a somewhat indirect support. And this is not what's happening now. Ukraine crisis is really bringing Europe and the United States together, and that makes, a lot of Chinese officials quite mad.
Very interesting comment. Very good. Let me move back to the room.
Hello, my name is Felix, and I have a bit of a speculative question. So there's a narrative that Putin is, while he used to be a stone cold opportunist or whatever, he's becoming more driven by emotion, more clinging more to romantic ideals. So yeah, I wanted to ask what you think of that assessment, or whether you think that maybe he's trying to cultivate that perception to make his threats more credible, or whether it's just wrong. Thank you.
So I think that's been a story that's very much being pushed right now, this idea that, his actions are irrational and he's basically losing his marbles, and, it's kind of not really, doesn't really know what he's doing anymore. And but and here I'm really thinking about research on authoritarianism. If we look at the research that we have on how leaders operate within authoritarian regimes, leaders within personalist regimes that concentrate all their power within the leader will oftentimes find themselves in the situation where the leader is so isolated from what's actually going on within a country and what the actual public opinion is, and frankly also what the opinion of his closest advisors are, right? Because there's so much fear around the leader that this is exactly the type of situation that's produced. And so I think I very much speak for all of us, it would be a fallacy to assume what we're seeing here is an irrational leader. We're seeing a leader with an information problem, but we're clearly seeing a leader who is, who is acting from his perspective in a very rational sense.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. I move to Willi Schulz, please, online.
Hello, also from my side, thank you very much for having this talk. Now, I want to circle back to the topic of the nuclear threat. It was dismissed quite early on by the panel because it's mostly a psychological use. And of course it is. It's a defensive deterrent or a way to circumvent conventional weakness. But I feel like this omits the third possible use, and it's the only use it's been used for, which was to break the fighting spirit of the opponent, the Japanese, or against Japan in the Second World War. Now, and Marina mentioned that if peace talks fail that are currently going on, Putin would likely move up the escalation ladder. I mean, there's a lot of conventional weapons that are quite horrific and would cause a lot of civilian casualties. But what is your assessment? Because it seems like you're assuming that he would stop from using nuclear weapons. But why is that? I mean, a nuclear attack on a non-NATO member is still just an attack on a NATO member, isn't it?
So why would Putin stop, I think is the correct.
Good to see you, Willi. He used to be my student. Now he moved on to greener pastures. I hope you're well. Well, So as you know, as probably most others of you know, there are two levels to nuclear weapons. So they're tactical, fairly small nuclear weapons. They can destroy, like a certain area, but like they cannot destroy an entire city or like an entire industrial site. Only strategic nuclear weapons can do the latter. But when it comes to these strategic nuclear weapons, still today there is what it's general termed mutual assured destruction, or like a MAD concept. So if Russia was to use strategic nuclear weapons and targeting them, whether this is Kyiv or whether this is Warsaw or whether this is Berlin, it knows for certain. And here's why I absolutely believe in this doctrine, that it will get destroyed as well. I think at this level, there will be mutual assured destruction. I don't think anybody would allow to have Kyiv just like wiped off the face of the earth with a nuclear weapon. I'm 100% certain. So that means the only option is these tactical nuclear weapons, small nuclear devices. And here, yes, it's true. There is a doctrine that has been, like debated in military nuclear circles that, as I mentioned before, it's called escalate to de-escalate. So what's the logic here? The logic is that the Russian government feels extremely cornered. And it wants to send a signal that enough is enough. You crossed a red line. So one could imagine that they use a small nuclear device, and this is most likely one of the Iskander rockets, and detonate it. And again, like in those circles, it's most likely, like debated or like that it will be used over a territory where there are no installations, so most likely over the Baltic Sea or the Black Sea. And it would detonate this nuclear weapon to send the signal to say, like enough, enough. And the idea here is that Putin would gain leverage. Right? And I can see that actually the process that he thinks might occur. So what might occur? It's very easy to detect that this was a nuclear weapon because of the radiation. If you have in all the headlines saying Russia is escalating to the nuclear level, what would you do? I would probably go on the street, like demonstrate. And I would probably put, in one form or another, pressure on the German government or the NATO government that some kind of solution needs to be found. But of course, this is exactly what Putin as well speculates with, right? Like he wants to escalate to this level, and that's why it's called escalate to de-escalate, because he thinks if he escalates, then he will actually get some kind of agreement on his terms, because everybody in the NATO countries will be so frightened, so terrified, so scared by a small nuclear escalation that, in the end, they will agree to what he wants. And that's why it's such a tricky situation, and it can be so powerful, right? Is there probability that he might use these small tactical nuclear weapons? Yes, this probability exists. Particularly because Russia over the last 10 years or so invested quite some money into developing new forms of these tactical nuclear weapons. But still, like I absolutely agree with Anita. I think Putin is absolutely rational. I don't think he has lost his marbles in any ways. And I think really going to this nuclear threshold is a totally new world, and I'm not sure he's willing to risk it. And, so even if Putin, decides to do so, I think there are still people in the military, and by the way, it's not just the generals, so it's not just the defense ministers, but it's also people who have to implement this then, so there's not a button that you press and that's on the desk of Putin and you can just launch a nuclear weapon. The processes behind are much more complicated. They need to be mounted either on submarines or on bombers or on, other kind of delivery devices. So you need manpower in doing all of this, like the setup. And I think, especially because this war is so controversial, that in this process behind the scenes, I can imagine that some kind of military person would say no, and would leak those plans or would do something about it. And so because the process is fairly complex and complicated, I'm actually not so worried that something will actually happen, because this is not a life or death war in the big picture of things. Maybe for Putin, but not for the Russian public. And if you see something happening right now is that the war is controversial. I don't think we can fully estimate how controversial it is, but it's certainly not a war where the entire Russian population stands behind it, as, you know, like it was in the Second World War or other wars, where it was a true, you know, like conviction that we need to fight that war. And that's why I think nuclear escalation is actually not that likely.
Can I ask Marina that you a very quick follow-up? Because I also have seen you write about this. So let's say Putin does do this over the Baltic Sea. There's radiation that drifts in the Baltics, maybe drifts to Poland or to Germany. Does somebody then have a tactical nuclear weapon someplace so that the radiation drifts into Russia? Or what would be the response? Because I'm looking again the game tree. I'm thinking, I hear you say that they're trying to split, but what's the next part of the game tree?
So believe it or not, you know, I was at the Munich Security Conference, like 10 days ago, it feels an eternity. And I basically spent my entire time just discussing those scenarios. And of course, this is, you know, yes, there are plans by NATO, but truth to be told, so I'm not entirely privy of those plans, right? Because this is massively classified. But it is something that, you know, probably most NATO countries would not just immediately say, okay, now we negotiate. But I can imagine that the population would ask for negotiations.
Thank you. I should say we only have 5 minutes left, so ask a very quick question. I'll try to, and I might, why don't I group 2 questions so we have a chance to get a few more people in. So why don't I have the next 2 please go? Here in the room.
Hi Marina, my name is Steve. I'm a first-year MIA student. Always to be glad in your classes. To be in your classes, always very good. My question is more biographical. I wanted to get into more, you know, the oligarchs and what they think about this war right now. And I know there's a lot of oligarchs that contributed to the creation of Russian grand strategy. So you've got people like Alexander Dugin, now probably Valery Gerasimov, who drafted, I guess, the military plans. He's kind of an oligarch kingpin in a way. So what, especially with now we've seen some oligarch kind of breaking ranks with Putin, how long do you think they'll kind of last? Because they have very different interests as well compared to, you know, what Putin currently has. And they have interests in, you know, keeping Putin in this bubble or, you know, taking him out of this bubble. So where do you think these oligarchs will go from here?
Thank you. Let's have one more.
Hi, my name is Sergio. I'm a second-year MIA student, and I just wanted to ask how is the grand strategy surrounding Belarus going to be changing as well, given that they are complicit with Russian actions as well?
Excellent. So I think it's oligarchs in Belarus. Who would like to go?
I'm sure, Anita, you can tell us as well something about the oligarchs and, you know. So what is interesting about the oligarchs? So what most people don't know, they're a different generation of oligarchs. There was actually a first generation of oligarchs, and this is the famous Abramovich, who then bought, you know, Chelsea and Khodorkovsky and, you know, like all sorts of like names that maybe you've heard before. These were all oligarchs that are actually, you know, like they rose to fame and fortune under Yeltsin. And they, you know, picked Putin as Yeltsin's successor. So why, you know, didn't they want just to have democracy go its flow? Well, because they were scared that they would get prosecuted, right? And that they would lose their wealth. And that's why when when Yeltsin got really sick, this is in 98, 99, they, you know, try to find somebody who, you know, like they thought that they could control, and this is how they found Putin. It's very important to understand how Putin actually rose to power. It was not because he was necessarily the best and the brightest or the most charismatic, you know, who won like all these local elections and then, you know, rose through the party ranks. No, he was picked by oligarchs, but the first generation of oligarchs. Those people thought, you know, he would be their loyal servant. But, and this is one of the big surprises to the oligarchs themselves, but also to all the Russia watchers, very quickly into his reign as Russia's prime minister, he actually turned around and told those oligarchs, okay, fine, you can keep your wealth. I'm not going to prosecute you. So this is early 2000, but you have to stay out of politics. politics? Well, a lot of this first generation of oligarchs didn't agree. And they tried to, in like various ways, take Putin down. But he already, like using all the means that he had at his disposal, meaning the police, the military, but also the tax authorities, went after them. And that's why a lot of this first generation of oligarchs now lives in London, lives in the United States. Frankly, also some of them live in Germany, in Switzerland, but de facto, they left the country. And they left the country because they were asked by Putin or forced by Putin to leave the country. Now, and that's very important, all these big companies that they had, meaning this is Rosneft, this is Gazprom, but this is also chemical companies, this is, like defense industrial companies, had to be given to other people, and this is how a second generation of oligarchs came into being. And when you look very closely at the second generation of oligarchs, they're all very close friends of Putin or former KGB colleagues or colleagues that he worked with when he was working in the mayoral office of St. Petersburg. That was his first job when he came back from Dresden, from the KGB. But, meaning the bottom line is he has very close connections with them. Some of them are his former, like where he lived with in St. Petersburg, literally neighbors, other, he's a very kind of like judo athlete type of person. It's like the Russian version of it. I forgot what it's called. It's not judo, but some kind of like Russian variant of it. Anyway, and so he has a very personal connection to these oligarchs. And going back to the sanctions, since these relationships are so close and so personal, it's kind of difficult to see like it's difficult to assess whether they like now if they feel really the heat of those sanctions, whether they would actually really drop Putin, because this is not just somebody who was like really good at banking and then became the head of the Russia bank. This is somebody who went to school with Putin or like served with him in the mayoral office, and then like Putin basically gave him that job. These people owe their wealth to Putin, and that makes like these connections so incredibly difficult to destroy. And so, do they have an impact on Putin? Well, sure, he relies on them, right? He relies on them because like they're kind of still like this is the productive force of Russia. Like they run these big companies and natural resource enterprises. But I think it's very much a mutual dependence as well. But the bottom line is that they're not necessarily the best and the brightest in what they do, which I think is very important as well. So these oligarchs, the first generation of oligarchs, I would say, they actually knew a lot what they were doing. The second generation of oligarchs, when you look now who is actually running Gazprom and who's running like the Bank of Russia, and also some of the private banks, they're not necessarily really trained people in those different areas.
Sure. I think Marina covered that background extremely well. I think just to get back to the sanctions, if you think about the way sanctions work, they either target the broader population and make them rise, or the idea, right? The logic is to make them rise up against their leaders, or by targeting the elite or the winning coalition around the leader and getting them to basically overthrow him and stage a coup. And as Marina said, we at the moment don't really know if that's a big possibility. What we do know from news that is coming out of specifically the Russian leadership is that Putin is not listening to his advisors at the moment, and that many of his advisors are too scared to talk to him about his current strategies. And so that doesn't bode well for long-term stability. What that means ultimately in terms of an actual coup is a very different question.
So we are out of time. I apologize for those of you who are still in line, but I want to thank very much our panelists, specifically Anita, Julian, and Marina. I think it was a fantastic discussion. I want to thank many of you for the questions that you had. And let me just emphasize what I said at the beginning. This is indeed the start of conversations about this I fear that Julian might be right that this will drag on a long time. I hope he's wrong. I hope the sanctions do what they're supposed to do, of course. But even if that were to be the case, even if they were to end tomorrow, this has significant implications that will last a long time. So I'm delighted to have you also here at the Hertie School, continue to talk about different sorts of things that happen here. And the last takeaway I got is, I should say to the three of you, you may not know this, but this I would almost call it a confidence that there's a rational actor who is sitting in Moscow, at least reassured me. A bit more of coming out than I did before, but maybe there is a dissident that's here in terms of how we move forward. And in any case, we'll continue these discussions. Thank you again for coming, and I look forward to seeing you more here at the Hertie School.